Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America, by Bruce Hoffman and Jacob Ware, narrated by David Vries. Preface. We began work on this book a month into the global COVID lockdown in April 2020. It was a dark, dangerous, and uncertain time. Conspiracy theories that had already gained widespread currency throughout the preceding years were now rampant across the internet and social media. The vilification of Jews, Asians, persons of color, and immigrants, among others, was reaching unprecedented levels, and I, Bruce Hoffman, had recently been the target of a serious hate crime. It was time to return to my analytical roots. Violent far-right extremism was the first account I worked on as a young terrorism and counterterrorism analyst when I joined the Rand Corporation's Security and Subnational Conflict Research Program in 1981. Everyone else in the program had already taken one of the more prominent left-wing and ethno-nationalist and separatist terrorists active at the time, so I decided to focus on a threat that was receiving less attention. This resulted in my first professional publication and a series of additional reports and scholarly articles on the threat posed by neo-Nazi and neo-fascist groups in Europe. Shortly afterward, however, my research shifted to focus on a similar trend then unfolding in the United States. By the middle of the 1980s, the U.S. Department of Energy had become increasingly concerned about the rise of violent far-right extremism and violence in this country. Because many of its nuclear weapon research, production, and storage facilities were located in states where this activity was increasing, the department asked RAND to conduct a detailed threat assessment. Between 1986 and 1995, I led a number of research projects and was the author or co-author of several reports and articles addressing the danger of far-right terrorism in the United States. One of these reports, published in 1988, identified these terrorists as the most likely to perpetrate a major future mass casualty attack in the United States, and another, published just weeks before the 1995 bombing of a federal office building in Oklahoma City that killed 168 people, again underscored the continuing threat from violent far-right extremists in this country and offered policy recommendations on how to address it. The historical pattern and potential for future violence from far-right terrorism in the United States also featured prominently in the first edition of my book Inside Terrorism, published in 1998. But then the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks occurred, and like most other terrorism analysts, my attention was diverted to Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, as well as their various affiliates and branches. Meanwhile, a succession of terrorist incidents in Oslo and Utøya, Norway in 2011, in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 2018, and in Christchurch, New Zealand, Poway, California, and El Paso, Texas in 2019, clearly showed that the same sanguinary ideology and hateful mindset that had fueled far-right violence during the closing decades of the 20th century had neither disappeared nor abated. I thus approached my friend and colleague at the Council on Foreign Relations, Jacob Ware, and proposed that we together write this book. The plot by a Michigan militia cell to kidnap and execute Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, uncovered in October 2020, and the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol infused our work with greater urgency. Bruce Hoffman, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Washington, D.C., July 2023. I was 16 years old on the day a bloodthirsty white supremacist murdered dozens of children at an island summer camp near Oslo in Norway, an incident covered in this book. As a citizen of a neighboring country who shared both an age and idealism with those murdered, the shooting shook me to the very core. This incident, coupled with my younger sister's brush with jihadist terrorism during a school trip to Toulouse in France, and my own experiences as one of the school shooting generation's earliest graduates, drove my desire to join the fight to make the world a safer and happier place, and to rid our nation of the cancerous hate by which it has too often been defined. My early counterterrorism research in graduate school at Georgetown University focused on more youthful networks, often composed of men and boys who had grown up in the same era I had. Like Bruce, my report, published some 37 years later with the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague, studied the far right, providing a threat assessment of the Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi group whose members were responsible for several murders in the United States. By the time 2019 arrived and the trajectory of the violent far right covered in this book reached an urgent stage with outbursts of violence at Christchurch, Poway, El Paso, and beyond, I was offered the opportunity to work under the legendary Bruce Hoffman, with this book project beginning shortly thereafter. My time writing this book has been defined by an imposter syndrome inevitable to anyone working alongside the doyen of their academic field, but I have come to appreciate that it is precisely my inexperience that provides a valuable perspective. This book is a reflection of our differing worldviews. Our strength as a writing team comes from our mix of pragmatism and idealism, our blend of deep historical study, and fluency in modern online culture. Jacob Ware, Washington, D.C., July 2023. 1. Accelerationism Reborn. We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution. Elizabeth, from Knoxville, Tennessee. In the summer of 2020, the messaging across far-right American Internet forums was jubilant. The one-two punch of the novel coronavirus pandemic, coupled with widespread protests and nationwide unrest, triggered by the murder of another unarmed African American by police, had laid the country low. Yet in this moment of collective despair, America's racists, bigots, anti-Semites, white supremacists, and anti-government extremists reveled in the newfound opportunities that had emerged throughout that year. Now was the time, their hateful posts on Telegram channels and seditious summons on Facebook proclaimed, to act decisively and bring the United States to its knees. On Facebook that April, President Donald Trump's tweets to liberate various states from their governors' COVID stay-at-home orders and defend Second Amendment rights had galvanized exponents of the Boogaloo, the mass insurrection-initiated civil war meant to overthrow the U.S. government. "Yo, the president is boog posting," exclaimed one typical message, until Facebook removed these friend groups and their posts from the platform at the end of June 2020. Its author was among over 72,000 members of such Facebook groups devoted to Boogaloo. Using other colloquialisms such as Big Igloo and Big Luau, or referring to themselves as Mujahideen, they explained how we the people need to stand up to what's right and revolt. We cannot allow our freedoms to be stopped or silenced. Organize and get off our asses and let's take back America. Another announced, "This has been a long time coming. Stand by for instruction," while a third showed a photograph of a loaded assault rifle with the message, "I heard there was going to be a big luau. Thought I'd dress appropriately." The posts on Telegram, an encrypted and anonymous chat app, were even more explicit. "Your world is crumbling around you," proclaimed one notorious user group, as the pandemic death toll rose that April. A few days later, another observed that the time was opportune to unleash pure terror on leading public figures and other societal elites. In May, yet a third neo-Nazi online channel advised that the name of the game is discrediting the system and making sure it's got its hands too full with others to crack down on you. And as demonstrations over George Floyd's killing spread across the country, an American neo-Nazi group argued that now is the perfect time to start doing stuff if you live in the U.S. Find a lawless area, look for a small group of N-word, fire on them from a concealed position, then run. While some posted and tweeted, Others were spurred to take action to hasten America's collapse. A month before the 2020 presidential election, a group of anti-government extremists who had connected over Facebook plotted to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. According to the FBI's affidavit, one of the ringleaders, a 40-year-old man named Adam Fox, was recorded saying, "In all honesty, right now, I just want to make the world glow, dude. I'm not even fucking kidding. I don't fucking care anymore. I'm just so sick of it. That's what it's going to take for us to take it back. Everything's going to have to be annihilated, man. We're going to topple it all, dude." His hope was that the kidnapping of Governor Whitmer would inspire other like-minded radicals in other states to similarly kidnap their own governors and try them for treason in kangaroo courts. "I can see several states taking their fucking tyrants," Fox exclaimed. "Everybody takes their tyrants." On January 6, 2021, a similar intent propelled the mob that stormed the U.S. Capitol building and attempted to seize Vice President Mike Pence and coerce him into nullifying the 2020 election results. Some rioters were photographed roaming the Capitol carrying flex cuffs, the heavy-duty plastic ties used by law enforcement in place of handcuffs, reportedly to subdue members of Congress, including Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other Democratic Party leaders whom they hoped to take hostage. Among the many memorable images of that day, however, was the photograph of a scaffold with a hangman's noose erected on the mall in front of the Capitol building. The scene evoked the imagined Day of the Rope, portrayed in the dystopian 1978 novel The Turner Diaries by the white supremacist William L. Pierce, when corrupt, self-serving liberal politicians, among others, are made to account for their misdeeds. Using daring, dramatic acts of violence to create chaos and disorder to lay the path for upheaval and revolution was also the motive of another would-be insurrectionist named Seth Aaron Pendley, who 6 months after he demonstrated at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, pleaded guilty to plotting to blow up the Amazon Web Services data center in Ashburn, Virginia. According to the Department of Justice's complaint, Pendley sought to kill off about 70% of the Internet, and thereby shut down the digital communications of the FBI, CIA, and other key federal agencies. In the ensuing chaos and disorder that he hoped would follow, Pendley sought to provoke a reaction from the oligarchy that he believed controlled the United States, and thereby finally convince the American people to take action against what he perceived to be a dictatorship. All of this conforms, ironically, to the Marxist strategy of revolution called accelerationism. Accelerationism is also the contemporary manifestation of a decades-old white power strategy to foment violent chaos as a means to seize power. Although first articulated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in their seminal 1848 pamphlet, Manifesto of the Communist Party, accelerationism first surfaced as a concept for a white supremacist revolution in the United States in the 1980s-era newsletter Siege, written by James Mason, who now lives quietly in Denver and has long been one of Pierce's most dedicated acolytes. Although mostly forgotten and never a leading figure in American white supremacism, Mason was resurrected as an avatar of contemporary far-right violent extremism by users of the notorious online message board Iron March. In 2015, that platform published a digital edition of the collection of Mason's past writings, which had been first published as a single volume in 2003. The actual concept of accelerationism does not appear until page 199, where Mason argues that the country isn't going, but has gone mad, that the final end of society is accelerating, that the entire foundation itself is thoroughly corroded. Now, isn't that the most encouraging thing anyone has reported to you in a long, long time? As the introduction to the 2003 edition explains, at this junction, social malaise cannot be halted, only accelerated onward to the abyss. In this current usage, accelerationism is embraced by a spectrum of white supremacists, white nationalists, racists, anti-Semites, xenophobes, and anti-government militants as a clarion call to revolution. They fervently believe that the modern Western liberal state is so corrupt and inept that it is beyond redemption and must be destroyed in order to create a new society and way of governance. With the West supposedly poised on the precipice of collapse, accelerationism's adherents maintain that violent insurrection is required to push democracy over the edge and into oblivion. Only by hastening its destruction can a white-dominated society and new order emerge. Fomenting divisiveness and polarization through violent attacks on racial minorities, Jews, liberals, foreign interlopers, and power elites, and thereby producing a cataclysmic collapse of the existing order and provoking a second civil war accordingly, is accelerationism's stock in trade. Accelerationists are especially dangerous, an analysis published in 2020 argued, because they believe that an act of mass violence by a single individual, a lone wolf or small cell, can trigger their desired race war. Such attacks are intended to force the white population to recognize their true enemy, join a revolutionary uprising, and destroy the political system. Accelerationists organize themselves to facilitate these attacks, following the principles of leaderless resistance and calling on individuals or small cells to perpetrate revolutionary acts of violence without centralized leadership. This was precisely the intention of both Brenton Tarrant, who perpetrated the March 2019 slaughter at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, and John Earnest, who carried out an attack just weeks later at a synagogue in Poway, California. Tarrant was explicit about the repercussive intentions of his attack that killed 51 people and wounded 40 others. His goal, he wrote, to incite violence, retaliation, and further divide between the European people and the invaders currently occupying European soil. To avenge those European men and women lost in the constant and never-ending wars of European history, who died for their lands, died for their people, only to have their lands given away to any foreign scum that bother to show up. To agitate the political enemies of my people into action. To show the effect of direct action, lighting a path forward for those that wish to follow. A path for those that wish to free their ancestors' lands from the invaders' grasp, and to be a beacon for those that wish to create a lasting culture, to tell them they are not alone. To create an atmosphere of fear and change in which drastic, powerful, and revolutionary action can occur. To add momentum to the pendulum swings of history, further destabilizing and polarizing Western society in order to eventually destroy the current nihilistic, hedonistic, individualistic insanity that has taken control of Western thought. Earnest was equally clear. There is at least one European man alive who is willing to take a stand against the injustice that the Jew has inflicted upon him, he wrote before the attack in an open letter posted on an internet site just before the shooting. That my act will inspire others to take a stand as well. I do not seek fame. I do not seek power. I only wish to inspire others and be a soldier that has the honor and privilege of defending his race in its greatest hour of need, and have a family, if possible. To my brothers in blood, make sure that my sacrifice was not in vain. Spread this letter, make memes, shitpost, fight back. Remember Robert Bowers, remember Brenton Tarrant. In case you haven't noticed, we are running out of time. If this revolution doesn't happen soon, we won't have the numbers to win it. The goal is for the U.S. government to start confiscating guns. People will defend their right to own a firearm. Civil war has just started. The accelerationist strategy that produced the Christchurch and Poway attacks and surfaced again in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, is far from new, and its sulphurous legacy can be traced back decades. This terrorist strategy is in fact part of a long tradition of extreme, destabilizing far-right violence. Indeed, each of the social media posts, dangerous plots, and violent incidents recounted so far reveals the dangerous continued resonance of the accelerationist strategy that Pierce always admitted to advocating in the Turner Diaries. To understand why and to put those events in broader context, one has to view January 6, 2021, as another milestone in a trajectory that commenced in the late 1970s and gathered momentum through the 1980s. Its evolution slowed following the nationwide law enforcement crackdown that resulted from the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, but was infused with new purpose after Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, and the economic recession that stunned the country the same year. And it was subsequently weaponized in the 2010s by social media, and further empowered by the febrile rhetoric and polarization of politics that continue to divide America. Today, accelerationism is the driving force behind fears that the United States is potentially on the verge of a new civil war. In her 2022 book, How Civil Wars Start, the renowned political scientist Barbara F. Walter argues that we are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe because of a toxic mix of political extremism and polarization, social and cultural tribalism, popular embrace of conspiracy theories, proliferation of guns and well-armed militias, and the erosion of faith in government and the liberal Western democratic state. Among the key factors she cites is accelerationism, which she describes as the apocalyptic belief that modern society is irredeemable and that its end must be hastened so that a new order can be brought into being. Stephen Simon and Jonathan Stevenson, two former National Security Council staffers with deep knowledge of sectarian conflicts in Northern Ireland and the Middle East, similarly describe a situation where the United States could easily tip into civil war. The country, they write, now appears to be in a state of unstable equilibrium, a term originating in physics to describe a body whose slight displacement will cause other forces to move it even further away from its original position, thus potentially emboldening violent action to plunge the United States into the chaos and disorder that is accelerationism's goal. The most dismal assessment, though, is that of the Canadian journalist Stephen Marsh, who in his 2022 book, The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, contends that a new American Civil War is inevitable. The United States is coming to an end. The question is how. To his mind, the United States is descending into the kind of sectarian conflict usually found in poor countries with histories of violence, not the world's most enduring democracy and largest economy. As febrile and alarmist as such assertions may be, there is more than a grain of truth to these fears. A 2021 survey conducted by the University of Maryland Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement and The Washington Post, for instance, found that fully a third of Democrats and slightly more Republicans believe the use of violence for political purposes is somewhat justified. This was the highest percent response to this question in the 2 decades it has been asked. Indeed, only 5 years before, no more than 8% of respondents from either party agreed when the same question was posed. Moreover, a year later, even more Republicans, 41% compared with 36%, again regarded politically motivated violence as somewhat justified. Somewhat more assuring was that the percent of Democrats responding positively when that question was again posed declined by 10 points. Overall, the new survey reflects how much the partisan wars continue to rage across the country a full year after the January 6 riot, The Washington Post noted of the 2022 survey, and hopes for unity have largely faded as doubts about democracy have grown. These fears had only intensified by the end of the year, as the United States Select Committee to investigate the January 6 attack on the United States Capitol concluded its work by voting to refer President Trump and his attorney, John Eastman, to the U.S. Department of Justice for prosecution. A Washington Post ABC News poll revealed that nearly 9 in 10 Americans, or 88%, were now concerned that ongoing political polarization had heightened the risk of politically motivated violence, with 6 in 10 stating that they were very concerned about this development. But neither polls nor predictions are prophecy, and motive without means is inconsequential, until one remembers that the United States leads the world by far in the number of firearms in private hands. Although the United States comprises only 4% of the world's population, it accounts for 40% of the globe's firearms. There are an estimated 400 million privately held firearms in the United States, more than 1 gun per person. Gun ownership in the United States is higher than the total of the other top 25 countries in the world whose civilians possess firearms. There are approximately 121 firearms for every 100 people in the United States, compared with 53 in Yemen, the number 2 country by proportion of population. Indeed, more guns were purchased in the United States during 2020 alone, 17 million, than in any other year on record. This proliferation of privately held weapons in the United States, Simon and Stevenson observe, make the leaderless resistance advocated by the late 20th century militia theoreticians and now epitomized by the far-right anti-authoritarian Boogaloo Boys, they of the Hawaiian shirts, all the more practicable. Indeed, among the most fervent defenders of Second Amendment rights are people who express their desire for a new civil war. And it was this fervent embrace of gun rights that electrified the militia movement in the early 1990s and motivated the deadliest terrorist incident on American soil until the September 11, 2001 attacks, the 1995 bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. For Walter, the existential fear that leads to a domestic arms race and increased firearms acquisition is an important indicator of the potential for the outbreak of insurgency that can then escalate to civil war and even to genocide. The United States is not on the verge of genocide, she hastens to explain, but if militias were to rapidly expand, become more brazen, and a sense of insecurity grows, right-wing terrorism in the United States could accomplish a more immediate objective. It could shift the country even more willingly toward authoritarianism. Walter sees the United States on the verge of the open insurgency stage defined by the Central Intelligence Agency's authoritative Guide to the Analysis of Insurgency, which, she claims, means we are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe. And even if the United States avoids an actual civil war, it is not difficult to imagine a variety of dark scenarios spanning a range of politically violent potentialities that would destabilize the country, further entrench existing divisions, and severely challenge our government's ability to protect its citizens. In his 2023 book on the erosion of democratic norms in America, Richard Haass, then president of the Council on Foreign Relations, raised the possibility of a version of Northern Ireland's long-standing troubles coming to the United States. If there is a model for what we should fear, Haass warns, it comes from Northern Ireland and the Troubles, the 3-decade struggle starting in the late 1960s that involved multiple paramilitary groups, police, and soldiers, and resulted in some 3,600 deaths and a sharp reduction in local economic output. Haass has direct experience of the pernicious effects of that tragic conflict, having served as U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process between 2001 and 2003, and then as chair of the multi-party negotiation that led to the 2014 Stormont Agreement, and leading American white supremacists, who have long been among the foremost advocates of civil war and sedition, have cited the Northern Irish exemplar and the province's preeminent terrorist organization, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, or PIRA, as worthy of emulation. Soon, Our version of the Troubles will be widespread, wrote Robert Miles, one of the early leaders of America's violent far-right underground, under his Norse.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?